not able to right now. That was cool. I can't believe I did that. What the heck? I'm not able to right now. That was cool.
25 of the world's most elite safecrackers, cryptographers, and engineers stood in a lavish, cigar-smoke-filled room, sweating under the cold, dead stare of New York's most ruthless syndicate boss. For 3 agonizing weeks, they had thrown everything at a heavily booby-trapped, centuries-old mechanical vault. All of them had failed. Millions of dollars were on the line, and patience had officially run out. But the person who finally cracked the impossible lock didn't have a PhD from MIT or a rap sheet for high-stakes bank robbery. It was a 22-year-old waitress making $12 an hour, armed with nothing but a silver serving tray, and she did it in exactly 60 seconds. The sprawling Moretti estate in Oyster Bay, New York, looked like a fortress disguised as a billionaire's playground, surrounded by 10-foot wrought-iron gates, security cameras hidden in the ancient oak trees, and men in tailored Italian suits carrying concealed Glocks. It was not a place for the faint of heart. For Eleanor Hastings, it was just another shift. Eleanor smoothed down the starched white apron of her uniform, adjusting the heavy silver tray balanced on her left hand. She worked for Sterling and Company Elite Catering, a high-end agency that serviced the ultra-wealthy of the East Coast. The pay was decent, but it was the cash tips that kept the lights on in her tiny Queens apartment and paid for the mounting medical bills at Mount Sinai Hospital, where her father was undergoing experimental treatments for early-onset Parkinson's. "Keep your head down, Hastings," whispered Richard, the panicked catering captain, as he wiped sweat from his brow. "These aren't tech bros or Wall Street bankers. This is Silas Moretti. You do not look him in the eye. You do not speak unless spoken to. You pour the Macallan 25, you clear the crystal, and you become a ghost. Understand?" Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of practiced indifference. "I understand, Richard." She pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the estate's private library. The air inside was thick with the scent of leather bindings, expensive Cuban cigars, and raw, suffocating tension. At the far end of the room, sitting behind a massive desk carved from black walnut, was Silas Moretti. He was 32, lethally handsome, and terrifyingly still. His sharp, aristocratic features were cast in shadow, his dark eyes locked onto the center of the room, like a hawk watching a dying mouse. He exuded an aura of absolute authority. Men twice his age were standing around the perimeter of the room, holding their breath. In the center of the Persian rug sat a heavy steel table, and upon it rested the source of the room's misery, a tarnished, brass and steel cylindrical puzzle box, roughly the size of a microwave. It was covered in hundreds of interlocking gears, strange astrological engravings, and sliding panels. Surrounding the table were 3 men in rumpled dress shirts, looking exhausted and terrified. One of them, a renowned British security engineer named Arthur Penhaligon, a man whose private firm designed vaults for Swiss banks, was trembling. Eleanor silently glided into the room, stepping carefully over thick cables that had been run across the floor to power laptops and scoping equipment. She approached the corner bar, keeping her eyes down, and began to decant a fresh bottle of scotch. "Mr. Moretti," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking, "I must reiterate, this is not a standard vault. It is a modified Kaufman cylinder, originally commissioned in 1892. Whoever brought it to you has rigged the internal mechanics. It's no longer just a puzzle." "Explain," Silas commanded. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a cold shiver down Eleanor's spine. She paused mid-pour, forcing her hands to steady. "There are 3 glass vials of hydrofluoric acid suspended inside the core chamber, directly above what we assume are the bearer bonds and the offshore ledgers," Arthur said, wiping his face with a silk handkerchief. "The tumblers are connected to a mercury tilt switch. If we drill, the vibrations break the glass. If we try to pick the magnetic locks and make a single incorrect rotation on the outer-to-outer rings, a spring-loaded pin shatters the vials. The acid will dissolve the paper contents in seconds." Silas leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. I didn't bring 25 experts into my home over the last 3 weeks to hear what can't be done, Arthur. I brought you here to open it. It's mathematically impossible to brute force, another expert, a younger tech prodigy from Silicon Valley, blurted out. There are over 4 million possible combinations on the outer rings alone, and the astrological symbols don't correspond to standard cipher patterns. Without the cipher key, we're guessing blind. If we guess wrong, the contents are gone. Silas stood up. He was well over 6 feet tall, moving with the predatory grace of a man who was entirely comfortable with violence. He walked slowly around the desk. "The Russian who left me this box is dead," Silas said softly, stopping directly in front of Arthur. "He died laughing, telling me the money inside was mine if I could take it. I have $50 million locked inside a brass toy. You are the 25th man to tell me it's impossible. I am out of patience." Eleanor picked up her serving tray, holding 3 glasses of the poured scotch. She needed to serve the men at the table and get out. She kept her gaze pinned to the floor, weaving past Silas's intimidating bodyguards. She approached the steel table to offer Arthur a drink. As she extended the tray, her eyes briefly landed on the brass cylinder. She froze. The engravings on the side of the box weren't just random astrological signs. It was a dual-layered complication, a mechanism she hadn't seen since she was 10 years old. Her grandfather, Elias Hastings, had been one of the world's most gifted master horologists, restoring complex antique clocks and automatons for private museums. He had taught Eleanor how to read mechanical blueprints before she could read English. She stared at the rings. The phases of the moon etched into the brass were aligned with a subtle, almost invisible Fibonacci sequence hidden within the decorative vines bordering the gears. It wasn't a mathematical cipher. It was a mechanical story, a lunar calendar tied to a specific date. "It's not a magnetic lock," Eleanor whispered. The room went dead silent. Eleanor hadn't meant to speak out loud. The words had slipped past her lips instinctively. She clamped her mouth shut, her eyes widening in horror as she realized every single man in the room, including the lethal Silas Moretti, had turned to look at her. "What did you say?" Silas asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur turned, glaring at her. "Waitress, leave the room. This is highly classified and dangerous work." "Quiet!" Silas snapped at Arthur, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. He took 2 steps toward her, his dark eyes analyzing her cheap catering uniform, her scuffed black flats, and her pale, terrified face. "I asked you a question. What did you say?" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Richard, the catering captain, who was standing by the door looking like he was about to faint. She knew she could be fired. Worse, she knew who this man was. Silas, the Viper Moretti, wasn't someone you annoyed and lived to talk about. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "Mechanics never lie, Eleanor. People do, but gears only tell the truth." I said it's not a magnetic lock," Eleanor forced herself to say, her voice shaking only slightly. She placed her heavy silver tray down on a side table. "The man you hired is looking at the problem backwards. He's treating it like a modern safe. It's an antique horological mechanism. A clockwork." Silas tilted his head, intrigued. "And how would a waitress from Elite Catering know what a Kaufman cylinder is?" "Because it's not a Kaufman," Eleanor said, finding her footing. She pointed a slender finger at a tiny, almost microscopic hallmark stamped near the base of the device, a small anvil with a crescent moon. "It's a Weber-Lindstrom puzzle box, Swiss, built around 1904. The astrological signs aren't a cipher. They're a date. You align the phases of the moon not by math, but by mechanical tension." Arthur scoffed loudly. "This is preposterous, Mr. Moretti. Are you going to let a maid dictate our engineering protocols? She'll trigger the acid." Silas ignored Arthur completely. He stepped closer to Eleanor, towering over her. "If you're wrong," Silas murmured, his voice so quiet only she could hear it, $50 million burns. And then I will make sure you burn with it. Eleanor looked up into Silas's dark, dangerous eyes. She saw no bluff in his expression, but she also saw desperation hidden beneath the ice. "I'm not wrong," Eleanor said. "Show me," Silas commanded. Eleanor took a deep breath. She stepped past the sweating British engineer and stood directly in front of the brass device. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, visualizing the internal blueprints her grandfather used to draw. She opened her eyes. She didn't use the tools, the laptops, or the scoping lasers. She simply placed both hands on the cold brass rings. Click. She twisted the top ring to the waxing crescent. Clack. She slid the secondary gear backward, engaging the tension spring. She ignored the numbers and focused entirely on the resistance of the metal, feeling the tiny vibrations through her fingertips. It took exactly 6 precise turns. Left, right, push, hold, twist. On the final turn, she pressed down firmly on the center star engraving. A loud, hissing sound echoed through the silent room. Arthur gasped, stepping back, bracing for the smell of burning acid. Instead, there was a heavy, metallic clunk. The top of the cylinder popped up, and the intricate brass panels folded outward like the petals of a blooming lotus flower. In the center, completely untouched, sat a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of bearer bonds. Eleanor withdrew her hands and stepped back, wiping her palms on her apron. She looked at the wall clock. 58 seconds. The silence in the library was absolute. 25 of the world's greatest minds had spent 3 weeks failing. She had dismantled the impossible trap in under a minute. Silas Moretti stared at the open box. Then slowly he turned his gaze to Eleanor. The cold, dead stare was gone, replaced by a burning, intense fascination that made Eleanor feel like she was the one caught in a trap. For the first time in his ruthless life, the Mafia Boss was completely, utterly speechless. The silence in the library was heavy enough to crush bone. Arthur Penhaligon, the supposed British security genius, looked as though he were going to vomit onto the antique Persian rug. The Silicon Valley tech prodigy was staring at Eleanor with his mouth hanging open. Silas Moretti finally broke the silence. He didn't yell, he didn't gloat. He simply raised his hand, adorned with a heavy gold signet ring, and pointed toward the heavy mahogany doors. "Everybody out," Silas commanded. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Mr. Moretti, I must protest," Arthur stammered, his face flushed with humiliation. "It was a fluke. She could have killed us all. You cannot possibly trust her." Silas's gaze snapped to Arthur, cold and venomous. "You had 3 weeks and a blank check. She had 60 seconds and a serving tray. Get out of my house before I have Dominic throw you off the roof." Arthur swallowed hard, grabbed his silver briefcase, and scrambled towards the exit, followed closely by the rest of the humiliated experts. Within moments, the sprawling library was empty, save for 3 people. Silas, a hulking, heavily scarred man standing by the window named Dominic, and Eleanor. Eleanor's hands began to shake. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she reached for her tray, her mind racing. What did I just do? I just showed up the most dangerous man in New York's payroll. "I should get back to the kitchen," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling as she avoided Silas's piercing stare. "Richard will be looking for me. I need this job." "You don't have a job anymore, Miss Hastings," Silas said. Eleanor's head snapped up, her heart dropping into her stomach. "What? How do you know my last name? Please, Mr. Moretti, you can't have them fire me. I have hospital bills." "I know your last name because it's embroidered on your apron," Silas interrupted smoothly, stepping around the desk. He walked toward her, moving with that same terrifying, predatory grace. He stopped mere inches from her. Up close, he smelled of expensive cedarwood, clean linen, and danger. "And you don't have a job with Sterling and Company anymore because I just bought the catering company, 5 minutes ago, via text." Eleanor stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. You bought an entire catering agency?" "It was cheaper than paying the $50 million I would have lost if those idiots had triggered the acid," Silas replied dryly. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing against the cheap fabric of her collar. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. Besides, I don't want you pouring scotch anymore. You're entirely too valuable for that. He turned back to the steel table and carefully lifted the heavy, leather-bound ledger from the open brass cylinder. He flipped through the aged, yellowed pages, his dark eyes scanning the handwritten Russian script. "My grandfather, Elias Hastings," Eleanor blurted out, unable to stand the quiet tension. "He restored pieces like that for private collectors. I used to sit in his workshop in Brooklyn. That's how I knew. It wasn't a magic trick. It was just mechanics." "I know exactly who Elias Hastings was," Silas said, closing the ledger with a soft thud. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms. He was a master horologist. He also built the locking mechanism for the secure vault at the Bellagio in Las Vegas back in the 90s. A vault that has never been cracked. Eleanor's eyes widened. "My grandfather didn't work for casinos. He worked for museums." Silas offered a dark, knowing smile. "Everyone works for the underworld eventually, Eleanor, whether they know it or not." He gestured to the ledger. "This book belonged to a Russian oligarch named Viktor Volkov. It contains the account numbers, routing codes, and blackmail material he used to control half the shipping ports on the East Coast. But more importantly, it contains a schematic." "A schematic for what?" Eleanor asked, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run out the front door. "For Volkov's private depository beneath a shell corporation on Wall Street," Silas explained, his eyes locking onto hers. 50 million in bearer bonds was just the appetizer in this brass box. There is over $400 million in untraceable diamonds and gold bullion sitting in a subterranean vault in Manhattan. And according to this ledger, Volkov had the vault custom-built by a disciple of your grandfather. Eleanor took a step back, shaking her head. No, absolutely not. I solved a puzzle box, Mr. Moretti. I am not a bank robber. I'm a 22-year-old waitress. I have a father at Mount Sinai Hospital with early-onset Parkinson's, and if I go to prison, he dies." Dominic, the scarred bodyguard by the window, let out a low chuckle. Silas silenced him with a glance. "Your father, Thomas, is under the care of Dr. Aris Blackwood, correct?" Silas asked. Eleanor felt all the blood drain from her face. "How do you—" "Because Dr. Blackwood owes me a very large, very bloody favor," Silas said, his tone turning deadly serious. He stepped into her personal space again, towering over her, trapping her between his massive frame and the mahogany desk. "Listen to me very carefully, Eleanor. You are no longer a waitress. As of tonight, your father's medical debts at Mount Sinai are 0. His experimental treatments are fully funded. He will be moved to a private VIP suite within the hour." Tears pricked the corners of Eleanor's eyes. It was a miracle, the exact miracle she had been praying for every night. But she knew a deal with the devil when she heard one. "What is the price?" she whispered, staring up at his sharp jawline. "You are going to help me break into Viktor Volkov's vault," Silas said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. "You are going to read the mechanics that those 25 experts couldn't even comprehend. You work for me now, and nobody says no to Silas Moretti." For the next 48 hours, Eleanor's world was turned entirely upside down. True to his word, Silas had her father move to the penthouse medical suite at Mount Sinai. When Eleanor visited him, the nurses treated her like royalty. Her father looked more rested than he had in years, completely unaware that his comfort was being paid for in blood money. But the gilded cage Silas built around Eleanor closed tightly. She wasn't allowed to return to a tiny apartment in Queens. Instead, Dominic drove her in a bulletproof black Maybach to a penthouse in Tribeca, owned by the Moretti family. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Hudson River. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but the heavy security doors and the men standing guard in the lobby reminded Eleanor exactly what she was, a prisoner with a VIP pass. On her third night, Silas summoned her to his private study within the penthouse. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with monitors displaying security feeds and encrypted financial data. Silas was sitting at a massive glass table, his suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to reveal dark, intricate tattoos creeping up his forearms. Spread across the table were massive, faded blueprints. "Sit," Silas commanded without looking up. Eleanor hesitated, smoothing down the expensive silk blouse Silas's staff had provided for her. She sat opposite him, her eyes drawn to the blueprints. Volkov's subterranean vault is located beneath an abandoned subway terminal near the financial district, Silas explained, tracing a line on the paper with a sleek silver pen. It's off the grid. No digital locks, no lasers. Volkov didn't trust modern technology. He trusted physics. Eleanor leaned forward, her mechanical curiosity temporarily overriding her fear. She studied the intricate drawings. The vault door wasn't a standard titanium slab. It was a massive circular array of interlocking brass counterweights, hydraulic pistons, and pendulum gears. "It's a cascading kinetic lock," Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting across the schematics. "My God, it's beautiful." Silas looked up, his dark eyes studying her face. He seemed captivated by the way her features lit up when she looked at the blueprints. "Explain." "Most vaults require a key, a code, or a biometric scan to trigger an unlocking mechanism," Eleanor said, pointing to a series of chambers on the diagram. "This one requires a sequence of physical kinetic impacts. See these chambers? They're water clocks. The door is balanced on a hydraulic axis. You don't pick this lock, Mr. Moretti. You play it like an instrument. If the weight distribution is off by even a fraction of an ounce, the pendulums lock permanently, and the entire vault floods with water from the East River." Silas leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his lips. It was the first time she'd seen him truly smile, and it made her breath hitch. It made him look less like a mob boss and more like a fiercely intelligent predator who had finally found an equal. "Dominic told me I was insane for putting a waitress on this job," Silas murmured, his voice rich with dark amusement. "But you see things they don't, Eleanor. You see the music in the metal." "I see a death trap," Eleanor corrected him sharply, pulling her gaze away from his mesmerizing eyes. "There are 4 primary counterweights. To open this, someone has to be inside the antechamber, manually adjusting the water flow to the pendulums while the gears are moving. If they miss the timing, they drown," Silas finished flatly. "Yes." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Who are you sending in there to do it?" Silas stood up slowly, walking around the glass table until he was standing directly behind her chair. He placed his large, warm hands on her shoulders. The heat of his touch seeped through her silk blouse, making her heart hammer frantically against her ribs. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke. "I'm not sending anyone, Eleanor," Silas whispered softly, the deadly promise hanging in the air. "We are going in together. Just you and me." The tactical gear laid out on the king-sized bed in the Tribeca penthouse cost more than Eleanor made in 2 years of catering. Silas had ordered it specifically for her. A fitted black arc-flash tactical suit from Cry Precision, Kevlar-lined boots, and a heavy utility belt equipped with state-of-the-art diagnostic tools. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the timid waitress in the starched apron. In her place stood someone who looked like she belonged in Silas Moretti's lethal, shadow-draped world. "The Kevlar is a precaution," Silas said, stepping into the room. He was already dressed in pitch-black tactical gear, a matte black Glock 19 holstered at his thigh. He checked the luminescent dial of his Rolex Daytona. Volkov was paranoid. "We don't know if the tunnels have been compromised by rival families since his death. If we run into rival mafia families in an abandoned subway tunnel, I am turning around and walking home, Mr. Moretti," Eleanor said, her voice tight with anxiety. Silas paused, looking up from his watch. He closed the distance between them with that same terrifying, silent grace, stopping when the toes of his boots met hers. He reached out, his leather-gloved fingers gently tucking a stray lock of her dark hair behind her ear. The contrast between his violent appearance and the shocking gentleness of his touch made Eleanor's breath hitch. "It's Silas," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "If we are going to die in a flooded chamber together, you might as well use my first name." Before Eleanor could formulate a response to that terrifyingly casual statement, Dominic's voice crackled over Silas's earpiece. "Boss, the perimeter at Broad Street is secure. The NYPD patrol has been paid off. We have a 45-minute window before the shift change." "Understood," Silas replied, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's. "Let's go." The ride to the financial district was a masterclass in silent tension. 3 armored Cadillac Escalades moved like a heavily armed convoy through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. They bypassed the glittering high-rises and pulled into a deserted, graffiti-covered service alley behind the Broad Street station. Dominic and 4 other heavily armed men formed a perimeter as Silas led Eleanor to a rusted service grate hidden beneath a pile of discarded wooden pallets. It looked entirely unremarkable, a forgotten piece of city infrastructure. With a sickening groan of metal, Dominic crowbarred the heavy grate open, revealing a pitch-black shaft plunging into the earth. The smell of ozone, damp concrete, and ancient stagnant water wafted up. "Stay directly behind me," Silas ordered Eleanor, clicking on a high-powered tactical flashlight. "Step exactly where I step." They descended a rusted iron ladder that seemed to drop endlessly into the abyss. When Eleanor's boots finally hit solid ground, she found herself standing in a cavernous, forgotten subway terminal. Ornate, arched tile work, reminiscent of the legendary abandoned City Hall station, was crumbling from the walls. The tracks were buried under decades of silt and debris. They walked in silence for what felt like miles, navigating the subterranean labyrinth guided only by the faded blueprints Silas had memorized. The air grew colder, heavy with the oppressive weight of the millions of tons of concrete and steel above them. Finally, they reached a dead end, a massive bricked-up archway. Silas gestured to Dominic, who stepped forward with a portable thermal lance. Within 3 minutes, the blinding white heat of the lance melted through the ancient mortar. The bricks collapsed inward, sending a cloud of dust into the damp air. As the dust settled, Silas aimed his flashlight into the newly opened space. Eleanor gasped. It wasn't a room. It was an engineering marvel buried deep beneath the earth. A massive circular antechamber made of riveted steel plates. At the far end stood the vault door, a colossal 20-foot-tall circle of oxidized bronze and steel. It was entirely covered in intricate, interlocking gears, massive counterweights, and 4 thick glass cylinders filled with stagnant, dark water. It was the cascading kinetic lock, the mechanism her grandfather's disciple had built for the Russian oligarch. Up close, it was both beautiful and terrifying. "We have 30 minutes before the external security window closes," Silas said, turning to Eleanor. The ambient light from his flashlight cast sharp, dramatic shadows across his aristocratic face. "The stage is yours, Eleanor. Tell me what to do." Eleanor stepped into the antechamber, her eyes sweeping over the massive puzzle. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. She walked up to the colossal bronze door, running her gloved hands over the cold, damp metal. She closed her eyes, blocking out the presence of the heavily armed men behind her, blocking out the millions of dollars at stake, and focused entirely on the mechanics. She pressed her ear against the steel. "The primary release isn't a handle," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. She pointed to a massive, rusted iron wheel bolted to the floor near the right side of the vault. "It's a hydraulic pump. It feeds water from the East River into those 4 glass cylinders. As the cylinders fill, the counterweights shift, aligning the internal tumblers." "So we turn the wheel," Dominic grunted, stepping forward. "No," Eleanor snapped, spinning around. If you turn it too fast, the pressure blows the seals, the pendulums lock, and this entire chamber floods. The water flow has to be perfectly timed with the rotation of the central gear. She looked at Silas. I need you on the wheel. You're the only one strong enough to turn it against the water pressure. But you have to listen to me. Exactly to me. A fraction of a second too early or too late, and we drown. Silas didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his tactical rig, shedding the heavy Kevlar and the Glock, tossing them onto the damp floor. He walked over to the rusted iron wheel, his muscles bunching under his black shirt as he gripped the frozen metal. Give the order, Eleanor, he said softly. On my mark, Eleanor said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stood directly in front of the massive bronze door, her hands resting on the two largest exposed gears. She needed to feel the vibrations to know when the internal tumblers were aligned. Turn it 1/4 rotation to the right. Now! Silas gritted his teeth, his broad shoulders straining as he forced the massive, rusted wheel to move. The sound of screeching metal echoed deafeningly in the chamber. Gurgle, hiss. Dark, freezing water began to pump into the first glass cylinder. Eleanor watched the water line rise, her eyes darting to the heavy brass counterweight suspended above it. Hold! Eleanor shouted. Silas locked his arms, halting the wheel. The counterweight dropped exactly 1 inch, engaging with a massive internal gear. A deep, heavy clack resonated through the floorboards. Good. Now a half rotation left, slowly. For 10 agonizing minutes, they performed a deadly, intricate dance. Eleanor read the microscopic shifts in the metal, calculating the hydraulic pressure and the kinetic energy in her head. Silas executed her commands with flawless precision and terrifying physical strength, sweating heavily in the freezing subterranean air. Cylinder 1, clack. Cylinder 2, clack. Cylinder 3, clack. We're almost there, Eleanor breathed, her hands aching from pressing against the freezing bronze. The final cylinder, Silas, this one requires a full rotation, maximum pressure. The water is going to come in fast. When the counterweight drops, you have to lock the wheel immediately, or it will bypass the tumbler. Silas adjusted his grip, his knuckles white. Ready? Now! Silas threw his entire body weight into the wheel. It spun a full rotation. The 4th glass cylinder instantly filled with a violent rush of black water. But then, disaster struck. A deafening crack echoed through the chamber. A rusted retaining pin on the massive wheel sheared off under the immense pressure. The iron wheel violently jerked backward, ripping out of Silas's hands and sending him crashing onto the wet concrete. Silas! Eleanor screamed. The wheel spun wildly out of control. The 4th cylinder didn't just fill, it overflowed. The pressure seal blew with a sound like a gunshot. Instantly, a geyser of freezing East River water exploded into the antechamber. The pendulum missed the tumbler. Eleanor panicked, stumbling back as the icy water hit her boots. The fail-safe is engaged. The vault thinks it's being drilled. Alarms didn't sound. Volkov's traps were entirely mechanical. Instead, heavy steel grates slammed down over the archway they had entered through, sealing Dominic and the guards outside. Boss! Dominic roared, slamming his fists against the impenetrable steel grate. Inside the chamber, the water was rising terrifyingly fast. It was already at their calves, churning violently. Silas scrambled to his feet, ignoring the blood running down the side of his face from where the wheel had struck him. He waded through the rising water toward Eleanor. "Can you fix it?" Silas yelled over the roar of the incoming flood. "The wheel is broken," Eleanor cried, pointing to the spinning iron valve. "The water won't stop. The primary gear is stuck out of alignment by an inch. I can't reach the internal release without the counterweight dropping." The water reached their waists. It was freezing, sapping the warmth from Eleanor's body in seconds. Panic began to claw at her throat. She was going to die down here, buried alive in a tomb of Russian gold. Her father would be alone. Suddenly Silas grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. "Eleanor, look at me!" She looked up into his dark, furious eyes. There was no fear in them, only absolute, lethal determination. "Tell me exactly where the gear is jammed," Silas demanded. "Behind the third panel," she yelled over the rushing water, now swirling violently around their torsos. "But it requires over 400 pounds of lateral force to move it manually. You can't just push it." "Watch me," Silas snarled. He waded to the heavy bronze door, the freezing water now chest-high. He wedged his heavy tactical boots against the lower rivets of the vault door. He reached his bare hands into the crushing mechanical gap behind the third panel, his fingers wrapping around the jammed, greased teeth of the massive bronze gear. "Silas, you'll lose your hands," Eleanor screamed. If the counterweight dropped while his hands were inside, it would sever them instantly. "Tell me when the pendulum swings," Silas roared, the muscles in his neck cording with inhuman effort. Eleanor forced her panic down. She was a horologist. She was an engineer. She watched the massive brass pendulum swinging wildly above them, out of sync. She tracked its chaotic rhythm. 3, 2, push. Silas let out a guttural, primal roar. He drove his boots into the door and pulled the jammed gear with everything he had. The veins in his forearms bulged violently, tearing the skin against the sharp edges of the machinery. With a sickening screech of metal against metal, the massive gear shifted exactly 1 inch. "Out! Get your hands out!" Eleanor shrieked. Silas yanked his bloodied hands free a fraction of a second before a 2-ton brass counterweight slammed down like a guillotine into the space where his arms had just been. The impact shook the entire chamber. Suddenly the rushing water stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sloshing of the chest-high water. Deep within the 20-foot door, a series of massive, echoing clunks reverberated. The cascading kinetic lock had aligned. Slowly, agonizingly, the colossal bronze door cracked open, breaking the vacuum seal with a heavy hiss. They had done it. Eleanor stood frozen in the freezing water, trembling violently from adrenaline, shock, and the cold. She looked at Silas. He was breathing heavily, his white shirt completely soaked and clinging to his muscular chest, his hands bleeding freely into the dark water. He looked at the open vault, and then he looked at her. Without a word, Silas waded through the water, closing the distance between them. Before Eleanor could process what was happening, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his solid, fiercely warm chest. He buried his face in her damp hair, holding her so tightly she could feel the chaotic, heavy beating of his heart. "You're brilliant," Silas whispered fiercely against her ear, his voice rough with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to awe. "You are absolutely brilliant, Eleanor." Eleanor clung to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face into his wet shirt. The notorious, ruthless Mafia Boss of New York was holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and heaven help her, she didn't want him to let go. The dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just his employee anymore. She had just survived the crucible with the devil, and she was beginning to realize she liked the fire. The freezing water of the East River churned around their waists, a stark reminder of the watery grave they had just narrowly escaped. Silas held Eleanor for a long, shuddering moment, his heavy breaths mingling with hers in the frigid air of the subterranean chamber. Slowly, Silas pulled back, though his bloodied hands lingered on her arms, keeping her steady in the current. His dark eyes swept over her face, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a low, raspy command. "I'm freezing," Eleanor admitted, her teeth beginning to chatter uncontrollably. "But I'm okay. Your hands, Silas." "I've had worse," he dismissed bluntly, though the deep gashes on his palms were bleeding freely. He turned his attention to the colossal bronze door, which had swung open to reveal a pitch-black corridor. "The fail-safes are disengaged. The water won't rise any further." He reached to his tactical belt, pulling a waterproof flare from a sealed pouch. He cracked it, and blinding red light flooded the space. "Let's see what a dead Russian oligarch thought was worth dying for," Silas said, stepping through the massive threshold of the vault. Eleanor waded after him, the water level dropping as they walked up a slight incline into the dry, climate-controlled interior of the depository. As the red flare illuminated the room, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a room. It was a cavernous bunker lined from floor to ceiling with reinforced steel shelving. Stacked upon those shelves were perfectly organized rows of solid gold bullion glittering under the harsh crimson light. In the center of the room sat a massive table stacked high with sealed lucite cases containing hundreds of millions in untraceable bearer bonds and velvet pouches bulging with uncut conflict diamonds. It was a staggering, obscene amount of wealth, more money than Eleanor could comprehend. But Silas didn't even look at the gold. His eyes were locked on a small, solitary titanium pedestal at the very back of the vault. Resting on top of it was a single black leather briefcase. "The money is just a distraction," Silas murmured, his boots squelching on the dry concrete as he walked past the pallets of gold. Volkov didn't build a cascading kinetic lock to protect cash. Cash can be replaced. Power cannot. Eleanor followed him, wrapping her arms tightly around herself to ward off the biting chill of her soaked clothes. She watched as Silas snapped the latches of the briefcase. Inside lay a thick, heavily encrypted hard drive and a stack of physical manila files. Silas pulled out the top file. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page. Instantly, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet even further. The air grew thick, suffocatingly tense. Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering violently in his cheek. The terrifying, lethally calm Mafia Boss from the library was back, but this time, the anger radiating from him was palpable. It felt like standing next to a live explosive. "What is it?" Eleanor asked softly, taking a step closer. Silas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the documents, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the paper. Volkov kept ledgers on everyone. Politicians, judges, rival syndicates. But this is a payroll registry. Volkov was funding a coup within the 5 families. "A coup?" Eleanor echoed, confusion lacing her voice. "Against who?" "Against me," Silas said flatly. He turned the file so Eleanor could see it. The page was a detailed ledger of wire transfers, offshore accounts, and dates extending back 3 years. And at the top of the page, listed as Volkov's primary informant and beneficiary within the Moretti syndicate, was a name printed in bold red ink, Lorenzo Costa. Eleanor recognized the name. Richard, the catering captain, had whispered it in terror back at the estate. Lorenzo was Silas's underboss, his right-hand man. "Lorenzo," Silas whispered, the name tasting like venom on his tongue. "He's the one who brought the brass puzzle box to the estate. He told me he intercepted it from a Russian courier. It was a Trojan horse. He knew the acid trap inside was rigged. He wanted me to force it open. He wanted the bonds to burn and the resulting explosion to kill me in my own library." Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. "But I opened it." "You opened it," Silas confirmed, turning to look at her. "You dismantled the trap. You kept me alive. And now—" Silas's eyes darted toward the vault entrance. "Lorenzo is the one who secured the perimeter topside at the Broad Street station." The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The heavily armed men waiting for them at the surface weren't there to protect Silas. They were Lorenzo's loyalists. They were trapped in a subterranean tomb, surrounded by millions in gold, with a traitor's army waiting directly above them. Suddenly, the heavy steel grate that had slammed shut in the antechambers groaned violently. "Boss!" Dominic's voice roared from the flooded chamber outside the vault. "Boss, we have a problem!" Silas quickly shoved the files and the hard drive back into the briefcase, locking it tight. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, his grip firm and protective, and pulled her toward the entrance. They stepped out of the dry vault and back into the knee-high water of the antechamber. Beyond the heavy steel grate, Dominic was standing waist-deep in the water, his Glock drawn and aimed up the dark tunnel they had used to descend. The 2 guards who had been with him were floating face down in the dark water, dark plumes of blood blooming around them. "Dominic, report!" Silas barked. "It's a hit," Dominic shouted back, his face pale beneath his scars. "Lorenzo's men just dropped my guys from behind. Lorenzo is coming down the tunnel right now. He's got 10 heavily armed shooters with him. They have thermite for the grate." Silas cursed violently in Italian. He looked around the flooded chamber. There was no other exit. The vault was a dead end. "Can you open the grate?" Silas asked Eleanor, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Eleanor looked at the massive steel bars separating them from Dominic. "It's a mechanical quarantine seal. It was triggered by the flood. I would need tools, dry schematics, and hours to override it." "We have seconds," Silas said. From the darkness of the tunnel beyond Dominic, the blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights cut through the gloom. The sound of heavy boots splashing through the water echoed off the cavern walls. "Well, well, well," a smooth, mocking voice called out from the dark. Lorenzo Costa stepped into the light. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a suppressed submachine gun. He looked at Dominic, then peered through the steel grate at Silas and Eleanor. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "I have to admit, Silas," Lorenzo called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I was expecting to find you drowned down here, but seeing you trapped in a cage like a rat, that's almost better." "Lorenzo," Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. He stood in front of Eleanor, shielding her body with his own. "You always were an impatient man. 3 years on Volkov's payroll, and you couldn't even wait for me to drown properly." Lorenzo chuckled, motioning for his heavily armed men to fan out around the grate. They aimed their weapons directly at Dominic, Silas, and Eleanor. "Volkov was a visionary. You, Silas, are a dinosaur. You rule with fear and outdated codes of honor. The 5 families need modern leadership. Hand over the briefcase, Silas. Give me the ledger, and I'll make sure your death is quick. I might even let the pretty little waitress live." Eleanor peered around Silas's broad shoulder. Her mind, trained to dissect complex moving parts, was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. She looked at the grate, the rising men, and then her eyes landed on something Silas had missed. When the retaining pin on the massive hydraulic wheel had sheared off earlier, it had exposed a massive, heavy-duty electrical junction box bolted to the cavern wall, the power source for the vault's emergency lighting and the city's ancient subterranean grid. The iron wheel had smashed the protective casing open, exposing thick, sparking copper wires directly above the churning, knee-high water where Lorenzo and his men were standing. The water in the antechamber was isolated from the tunnel where Lorenzo stood by a raised concrete lip. "Mechanics never lie," her grandfather's voice whispered in her mind. "Physics is absolute." Eleanor leaned forward, pressing her chest against Silas's back. She slipped her mouth close to his ear, her voice barely a breath. "Silas, the electrical junction box on the right wall. The casing is smashed. If I throw the heavy iron retaining pin at it, the live wires will drop into the water on Lorenzo's side." Silas didn't move a muscle, but she felt his breathing shift. "It will electrocute everyone standing in the tunnel," Silas whispered back, his lips barely moving. "Dominic is standing in that water." "Dominic is wearing rubber-soled, insulated tactical boots," Eleanor whispered frantically. "I saw them when he suited up. Lorenzo and his men are wearing leather dress shoes. Leather is a conductor. Rubber is an insulator." Silas's eyes flicked to the heavy iron pin resting on the concrete lip near his boots. It weighed at least 10 pounds. "You have 5 seconds, Silas," Lorenzo shouted, raising his weapon. "Toss the briefcase through the bars or we light you all up." "Dominic," Silas commanded, his voice suddenly ringing out with absolute authority. "Brace." Dominic, trained to follow Silas's orders without hesitation, instantly locked his knees, keeping his boots planted firmly on the floor. In one explosive fluid motion, Silas bent down, scooped up the heavy iron retaining pin, and hurled it with terrifying force, not at Lorenzo, but at the cavern wall. The heavy iron slammed directly into the exposed junction box. Sparks showered like a fireworks display. With a horrific, tearing sound, the massive bundle of high-voltage copper wires ripped free from the wall and plunged directly into the standing water of the tunnel. A blinding arc of blue electricity flashed through the darkness. The water instantly boiled. Lorenzo and his 10 men didn't even have time to scream. The massive electrical current surged through the water, bypassing Dominic's heavy rubber boots, and traveled straight up through the soaked leather shoes of the traitors. The submachine guns fired wildly into the ceiling as the men were violently electrocuted, collapsing instantly into the dark, smoking water. Within 3 seconds, the circuit breakers on the main grid blew. The cavern plunged into pitch-black darkness, save for the eerie red glow of Silas's dropped flare. Silence descended on the tunnel, broken only by the sizzling of the water. Eleanor covered her mouth, her eyes wide as she stared at the carnage beyond the grate. She had just weaponized physics. She had just killed 11 men. The reality of it hit her stomach like a lead weight, and her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ground, Silas caught her. He pulled her securely into his arms, lifting her completely out of the freezing water. "Dominic!" Silas yelled into the dark. "I'm good, boss," Dominic called back, his voice shaking slightly as he surveyed the floating bodies of Lorenzo's hit squad. "I'll get the plasma torch from the packs Lorenzo dropped. I'll cut you out of there." 20 minutes later, the heavy grate was a pile of melted slag. Silas carried Eleanor, who was now shivering violently from a mix of shock and hypothermia, through the tunnel. Dominic took the lead, heavily armed, and carrying the briefcase containing the gold ledger and the blackmail files. When they finally climbed the rusted ladder and emerged back into the rainy, neon-lit alleyway of the financial district, Eleanor felt like she had stepped onto another planet. The world above ground was exactly the same, but she was fundamentally changed. Silas placed her gently into the back of the heated, armored Maybach. He climbed in beside her, immediately wrapping her in a thick, heated cashmere blanket he pulled from a compartment. "Drink this," Silas ordered softly, uncapping a silver flask and holding it to her lips. The amber liquid burned down her throat, settling the violent shaking in her chest. She looked at him. The blood had dried on his handsome, aristocratic face. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He wasn't looking at her like a waitress. He wasn't even looking at her like an employee. He was looking at her like she was the most dangerous, brilliant thing he had ever encountered. "You saved my life, Eleanor Hastings," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Twice in 1 week." I just used the tools available," Eleanor whispered, clutching the blanket. "I need to go home, Silas. I need to see my dad." Silas reached out, his bandaged hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cold cheekbone. "Your father is safe, and you will see him tomorrow. But you aren't going back to Queens, Eleanor." "Silas, please." "You belong to this world now," Silas interrupted, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his breath. "You dismantled 25 experts in 60 seconds. You cracked a subterranean kinetic lock that would have drowned an army. You outsmarted my underboss and wiped out a hit squad with a single piece of iron. You have a mind that the underworld would kill to possess." His dark eyes softened, a dangerous, possessive fire burning within them. "I am never letting you go. You aren't just working for me anymore, Eleanor. You are going to rule by my side." Eleanor stared into the eyes of the Mafia Boss, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs. She thought about her old life, the $12 an hour shifts, the crushing debt, the feeling of being invisible. And then she thought about the fire, the adrenaline, and the terrifying magnetic man sitting beside her who had just laid his empire at her feet. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she took a deep breath, the scent of rain, cedarwood, and gunpowder filling her lungs. "If I'm staying," Eleanor said, her voice steadying as a newfound steel settled in her spine, "I want my own desk in the library, and I don't pour the drinks anymore." A slow, devastating smile spread across Silas Moretti's face. He leaned in, his lips brushing softly, promisingly, against hers. Done. And just like that, Eleanor went from a struggling waitress pouring drinks to the brilliant, untouchable queen of the Moretti Syndicate. What an incredible journey. What did you think of Eleanor's genius, quick thinking in that flooded vault? Would you have had the nerve to weaponize the city's power grid, or would you have frozen in panic? And more importantly, would you have stayed by Silas's side to rule the underworld, or would you have tried to take the money and run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this intense mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love a brilliant underdog story, packed with dark twists. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We upload thrilling new audio stories every single week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.